The room was quiet, almost too quiet, except for the soft hum of the espresso machine and the occasional clink of coffee cups against saucers. Keanu Reeves was seated at a small corner table, absorbed in a book, his deep brown eyes flicking over the pages in the way only someone who had mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight could. He didn't want to be noticed, not that he minded being recognized, but there was something about the simplicity of sitting in a cafe, blending in, that he loved. It reminded him of when he was just starting out, when nobody cared who he was. Today, he wasn't Keanu Reeves the actor, the star of 1,000 blockbuster movies. Today, he was just a guy at a cafe. But that calm, uneventful atmosphere was about to shatter. As the door to the cafe swung open, a woman and her young son stepped inside. The cold air clung to them as they shook the snow off their coats. The woman's face was drawn, her features tired, as though the weight of life had been bearing down on her for far too long. She stood awkwardly at the door, looking around, hesitant. Her son, clutching her hand tightly, stared up at the menu board, eyes wide with excitement, unaware of the world's judgment. Keanu watched as they stepped toward the counter, where the barista, a young man with an attitude, was ready to serve. The barista barely glanced up when they approached. "Can I help you?" His tone was dismissive, a little too loud, as if he was already sizing them up. Keanu could tell the woman felt it immediately. Her body stiffened, and she shifted on her feet. The woman opened her mouth to speak, but her voice faltered. She didn't belong here, at least not in the eyes of the barista. "I'll just have a coffee," the woman said, her voice weak. "A small one, please." The barista raised an eyebrow. "A small one?" He looked her over like she wasn't worth his time. "You know, we've got these nice lattes, but that'll cost you a bit more than a coffee. You sure you can pay for that?" The woman's face flushed, a mix of embarrassment and frustration filling her chest. Keanu could feel the discomfort radiating from her, her eyes darting to her son, who was now looking at the pastries, eagerly pointing at the chocolate croissants. But there was no way she could afford that. She hesitated for a moment, trying to find the words, but the barista cut her off again. "Look," he said with a smirk, clearly enjoying the power trip, "maybe you'd be better off at one of those cheap places down the street, huh? You don't exactly fit the vibe here." It was at that moment that Keanu, who had been quietly observing from his seat, finally stood up. The whole situation had been eating at him. He was used to seeing unfairness in the world, but something about this felt personal. Something about the way the woman had shrunk, trying to maintain her dignity, while the barista seemed to thrive off making her feel small. Keanu couldn't just sit by. He walked up to the counter, his footsteps soft on the hardwood floor, but his presence impossible to ignore. Without a word, he placed his hand gently on the woman's shoulder, startling her. The barista paused, eyes widening slightly as Keanu addressed him directly, his voice calm but firm. "She's fine here," Keanu said, meeting the barista's gaze, "and I'll take care of the bill." The barista, now thrown off balance, stammered, but..." "No buts," Keanu interrupted. "It's on me." The woman, still processing the turn of events, looked up at him, her eyes filled with confusion and gratitude. "But I don't know if I can," she started, but Keanu shook his head. "You don't have to explain," he said with a soft smile. "You came here for a reason, right? Enjoy your coffee." The barista, stunned, seemed to want to protest, but Keanu held his ground. He turned his attention back to the woman, offering her a warm smile that was so genuine, it disarmed her completely. Her lips parted, unsure of what to say, but all she could do was nod and look down at her son, who was now smiling back at her, unaware of the tension that had filled the room just moments before. The barista, muttering under his breath, finally went to prepare the coffee, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. Keanu took a step back, returning to his seat, but not before giving the woman a last look, a small, quiet gesture of reassurance. The woman took a deep breath, her shoulders finally relaxing. The weight she'd been carrying, if only for a moment, seemed to lift. The world hadn't stopped for her, but for once, someone had seen her. And just like that, Keanu had reminded her of something she hadn't felt in a long time: dignity. The coffee machine hummed louder now, but it seemed to drown out everything around them. Keanu watched as the woman, still in shock, took a deep breath and turned to face the counter where her coffee was being made. The room had settled, but there was still an odd energy hanging in the air. The barista, though silent, seemed more flustered now than he had been moments before. He tried to act busy, wiping down surfaces that were already clean, avoiding eye contact with Keanu as if somehow this awkward interaction would just disappear. It didn't. Keanu took a seat again, his gaze steady but not intense, like he wasn't trying to draw attention. His mind, however, was racing. It wasn't the first time he'd done something like this, not in the exact same way, perhaps, but in the sense of standing up when no one else would. It wasn't about being a hero. It wasn't about being seen as some kind of savior. For Keanu, it was just simple. It was a human thing to do, to show kindness when it was needed. And right now, the woman needed it. Her son, still holding tightly to her side, was now distracted by the pastry case, his small hands pressed against the glass as he leaned in closer, his face lit up with wonder. Keanu watched them both, noticing the woman's expression soften. She glanced down at him, brushing a hand over his head, before turning back to her order. The pause in the air seemed to last forever, and Keanu could feel the barista's unease from across the room. After a few minutes, the woman took the coffee, still unsure whether she should thank Keanu or not. She hadn't even looked at the price yet. Keanu had already made it clear that wasn't necessary. But that didn't seem to stop her from feeling a heavy weight of gratitude she couldn't quite understand. When she turned toward the small table where Keanu had returned to, he was already looking back at her, waiting for her to come over. "Thank you," she said softly, the words almost getting lost in the space between them. Keanu simply nodded, his expression gentle but not intrusive. "No need to thank me. Just take a seat." She did. And then, a moment of silence. The son was busy with the croissants now, and the woman stirred her coffee slowly, her hands shaking. Keanu could tell she wasn't used to this level of kindness, or maybe the ease of it. Most people didn't hand out things without expecting something back. There was a hesitance in the way she stirred, as if she wasn't sure if this was real or some kind of trick. Her eyes flicked to the barista, who was still working, avoiding the situation altogether. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but Keanu wasn't going to let her feel that way for long. "I know it's hard," Keanu finally said, his voice quiet, but it carried an understanding that felt personal. "The world can be tough. People don't always treat others right." She looked up at him, clearly surprised that he was speaking to her, especially with such sincerity. She tried to offer a small smile, but her lips quivered instead, and the tears she'd been holding back began to spill over. "I don't know what I was thinking," she said, wiping at her face, her voice thick with emotion. I just wanted to give him something, you know? Something nice. He's been through enough already." Keanu nodded slowly. "You're doing what you can. That's all anyone can do." He paused, his eyes shifting to the boy, still happily eating his pastry. A little kindness goes a long way. Even when you think it doesn't matter, it always does. She wiped her face and nodded, still struggling to hold it together. "It just feels like it's never enough, you know? Like I'm never enough." Keanu's gaze softened as he leaned forward slightly, his tone steady. "That's a feeling a lot of people live with every day. I know I have, but it's not true. It's just a story we tell ourselves sometimes." She met his eyes, her brows furrowing, trying to understand what he meant. She had never expected this conversation, not in a place like this, not with someone like him. Keanu had this way of speaking calm, but so direct, that made everything else fade into the background. And for a moment, she wasn't a mother just trying to survive. She wasn't the woman who had been judged for her clothes, for her choices, for the life she lived. She was just a person, sitting with another person who understood. "I don't even know how I got here," she said, her voice quieter now, almost as if she were confessing something she had kept locked away for far too long. I moved here a couple of years ago, thought things would be better. But they're not. I've got nothing to offer him except what's in front of me. And I don't even know if it's enough." Keanu shook his head slightly. "It's more than enough. The fact that you're here, the fact that you care enough to make sure he's happy, that's everything." The woman fell silent, looking down at her hands. Keanu didn't push, didn't ask any more questions. He just let her be, let her think, let her process the kindness that had come from somewhere unexpected. He knew she would need time to absorb it, to realize that not everything had to be hard, that not everyone was out to take from her. Sometimes, just sometimes, people were there to give. After a few moments, the boy finished his croissant and looked up at his mom, his eyes bright. "Can we come here again, Mom? This place is awesome." The woman laughed softly, the sound warm despite the sadness that lingered. She ruffled his hair. Maybe we'll come back." Keanu smiled, seeing that small shift. It wasn't much, but it was something. He stood up, ready to leave. The woman, still catching her breath, looked up as he moved toward the door. "Thank you," she said once more firmly now, like she had finally found the right words. "I don't know how to thank you enough." Keanu turned back, a soft smile playing at the edges of his mouth. You don't have to. Just keep going. That's all any of us can do. With that, he stepped out into the crisp air, leaving behind a woman who, for the first time in a long while, felt like she might just have enough after all. And as the door swung shut behind him, the room seemed to shift, just a little, like the world had been in her favor for a moment, and the weight she had been carrying was just a little bit lighter. A few weeks had passed since Keanu's quiet gesture in the cafe. The encounter had been brushed off by most people, including Keanu himself, who had already moved on to the next day, the next film, the next responsibility. But for the woman, whose name Keanu still didn't know, life had shifted in small, meaningful ways. It was a slow process, one that couldn't be measured in quick bursts of excitement, but in the quiet moments between life's noise. She hadn't been able to forget that moment, when a stranger, a celebrity no less, had treated her with kindness, had shown her that not all people were out to judge her or belittle her. It was an afternoon when she found herself sitting in a dingy diner on the corner of a street she walked by every day. Her son was drawing on a napkin with crayons, while she stared absently out the window, watching the city go by. There had been no sudden miracle, no dramatic change, but her thoughts had started to shift. The heavy weight of her guilt and self-doubt was still there, but it wasn't as oppressive as it used to be. Maybe she had been wrong to assume she wasn't enough for her son. Maybe she had been wrong to think that nothing she did could ever make a difference. Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard the bell above the door ring, signaling someone had walked in. She turned slightly, half expecting it to be a familiar face, maybe a neighbor. But when her gaze landed on the man who had just entered, her heart skipped a beat. It was Keanu. She froze, unsure of what to do. It wasn't that she had ever expected to see him again, but there he was, as calm and quiet as the last time they'd met. He didn't seem to notice her right away, moving toward a booth by the window, his usual, unassuming demeanor still intact. The waitress behind the counter greeted him, and he offered her a polite smile before sitting down. It was strange, seeing someone so famous in such an ordinary place, with no cameras, no lights, no attention drawn to him. He was just a man, like any other man, sitting in a diner. Her son, still focused on his drawing, didn't even notice the man she was staring at, but she couldn't help it. The memory of that day, the coffee, the kindness, the way he had taken the time to speak to her, came rushing back in waves. And in that moment, she made a decision. She stood up, and before she could second-guess herself, she walked over to his booth. "Excuse me," she said quietly, feeling the nerves rise in her throat. "I don't know if you remember me, but I was the one, in the cafe, a few weeks ago, with my son." Keanu looked up, his expression warm but slightly surprised. "Of course I remember you," he said, his voice steady but not at all distant. "How are you doing?" The question caught her off guard. She hadn't expected it to be so casual, so genuine. She had half expected him to dismiss her, to move on, but there he was, asking without any sense of obligation. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer, but then she smiled, just a little. "I'm doing better," she said, her voice almost quiet enough to be lost among the noise of the diner. I think I'm starting to believe that maybe I'm doing okay." For him. Keanu nodded, his eyes softening. "That's good to hear. Sometimes, it's easy to forget how much we do, just by showing up every day." She smiled again, feeling a little lighter. It wasn't some magical breakthrough, but there was something comforting about this simple exchange, this recognition of the effort, of the struggle that was so often invisible to everyone else. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she continued. "About how, even when it doesn't seem like it, we're doing enough. It's hard to believe, sometimes, but I think you're right." Keanu's gaze was steady, and for a moment, she could almost feel the weight of his words settling in. It's a tough world, and a lot of people don't see the quiet struggles. But it doesn't mean they're not there. The things that matter aren't always the loudest things. It's the small things, the everyday choices, that can make a difference in ways we don't always understand. She nodded slowly, the weight of those words sinking in deeper now. It wasn't about the big moments, the dramatic life changes. It was about the tiny decisions, the constant showing up, even when the world seemed to push back. She looked down at her son, who was now looking up at her, his face lighting up when he saw that she was talking to Keanu. "Mom," he said, his voice excited. "You know Keanu Reeves?" "The Keanu Reeves." She smiled, shaking her head lightly. "Yeah, buddy. I know him." Keanu chuckled softly. "I wouldn't say I know her, but I've met her," he teased, and for a moment, they shared a quiet laugh. It wasn't a big deal, just a moment of connection. But to the woman, it felt like everything. It felt like one of the first times in a long time she had allowed herself to laugh, allowed herself to remember that things could be simple, that people could be kind, even when they had every reason not to be. As Keanu stood up to leave, he offered her a final, reassuring smile. "Take care of yourself. Take care of him," he said softly. "It'll work out." And with that, he walked out of the diner, just as quietly as he had come in. But this time, the woman didn't feel like she had been left behind. She didn't feel invisible anymore. She didn't feel like she was just another face in the crowd. She felt like she mattered, like her son mattered, and that maybe, just maybe, she was doing enough. And in that fleeting moment, the doubts that had been clouding her mind for so long began to fade. For the first time in years, she didn't feel so alone. The days after that brief encounter in the diner passed quietly for the woman. Her life, though still filled with its usual challenges, seemed to have softened a little, the sharp edges of her self-doubt and guilt dulled by something she couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't the kind of change that others would notice immediately. There were no sudden bursts of confidence, no drastic life-altering decisions, but there was a shift, an internal one that made her breathe a little easier. She still struggled with the same pressures, the same worries, but she had begun to see them differently. She no longer felt like she was constantly failing, no longer felt that every mistake was unforgivable. There were still days when the weight of everything felt like it would crush her, but the moments in between, those quiet ones where she had learned to just be, were starting to feel lighter. Her son was doing better too. He had always been a happy kid, but now there was something else in him, a new energy that she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the croissants or the occasional trip to the park. It was something more, a quiet confidence that she hadn't seen before. He seemed more grounded, as if he was starting to feel the weight of the world, too, but in a way that was easier to bear. The days seemed to blend into one another as they found a rhythm, and in the stillness, the woman began to notice more of the little things, small gestures from strangers, words from her friends that held more meaning, and a growing sense of connection she hadn't realized she had been missing. One afternoon, while she was walking with her son, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, half expecting it to be a reminder or a work email, but the name on the screen made her pause for a moment. It was an unfamiliar number, but there was something about it that made her heart skip a beat. She answered without thinking too much about it. "Hello," she said, her voice still warm from the afternoon sun. "Hi, is this the woman who was at the diner last month?" a voice asked. It was clear, but with a bit of hesitation, like the speaker wasn't sure if they had the right person. "Yes, that's me," she replied, now more curious than anything else. "Who is this?" "This is David," the voice on the other end said. "I work for Keanu. He mentioned you a few weeks ago, and I hope you don't mind me reaching out. He asked me to get in touch." Her heart thudded harder now. She hadn't expected this. What could Keanu have possibly wanted? She didn't know what to think, but she couldn't deny that her curiosity was piqued. What does he need?" she asked, though she instantly regretted sounding so blunt. She wasn't used to being on the receiving end of such unexpected calls. David chuckled lightly. "It's not like that, really. Keanu just asked me to check in. He wanted to make sure you and your son were doing okay. He remembered the conversation you had, and, well, he just wanted to offer some help, if you needed it." The woman was silent for a long moment. She didn't know how to respond. Keanu Reeves, someone she had only met for a few minutes, remembered her? She could feel her stomach twist in disbelief, but there was also something else, a growing sense of awe. "I don't understand," she finally said, her voice shaking a little. "Why? Why would he?" David paused before answering. "I think you should speak to him directly. He's been known to do this kind of thing. He doesn't want attention for it, though, so don't worry about that. He's just offering support in whatever way you think would help." She stood there on the sidewalk, trying to process the conversation. The world felt a little surreal, like she had stepped into a movie and was waiting for the credits to roll. She had no idea how to respond to this kind of generosity, not because she wasn't grateful, but because it was so far beyond what she had ever expected. No one had ever offered to help her like this before. There were always strings attached, always expectations that came with the offer. This was different. I don't know what to say," she finally managed to reply, her throat tight. "I don't even know what kind of help I need. I don't want to take advantage of his kindness." "You're not," David reassured her. "Keanu's offer is completely up to you. No pressure. If you want to meet with him, he's open to it. If you want to take a different route, that's fine too. He just wants to make sure you and your son are okay." The woman paused again, looking at her son, who who was now tugging at her sleeve, eager to show her the butterfly he had just drawn on his pad. It was simple, like all his drawings, but there was something about it, something innocent and hopeful that made her heart ache. The boy had always been her reason to keep going, to keep trying, even when everything felt impossible. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for her to allow herself to accept help, to stop fighting the world on her own. "I'll think about it," she finally said. "Thank you for calling." David's voice softened. "Of course. No rush. Just take care of yourself." She hung up, still feeling a mix of confusion and gratitude. The idea of meeting with Keanu again felt both overwhelming and strangely comforting. She couldn't deny that part of her wanted to say yes, wanted to sit down with him and tell him everything, the struggles, the loneliness, the quiet fear that had been with her for so long. But another part of her, the part that had always believed she had to do everything herself, was hesitant. She had never been the type of person to ask for help, to accept it without a second thought. As she slipped her phone back into her pocket, she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Maybe it wasn't about taking something from someone else. Maybe it was just about allowing herself to believe, for once, that it was okay to receive. After all, it wasn't every day that someone, especially someone like Keanu, offered help without any agenda. And maybe that was the point of it all, that she wasn't alone, that she didn't have to do it all on her own. Maybe that's what Keanu had been trying to show her all along. Her son tugged at her sleeve again, breaking her thoughts. She smiled down at him, feeling the weight of the decision before her, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel quite so alone. The days that followed were a blur of thoughts, doubts, and an increasing sense of pressure that she hadn't expected. The woman went over the phone conversation in her head time and time again, each time trying to figure out what she should do. She kept thinking of her son, how he would benefit from whatever Keanu's offer could provide, how he deserved a chance at something better, something easier. But then she would stop herself. She would pull back, reminding herself that she wasn't the type of person who asked for help, that she couldn't just accept something so extraordinary from a stranger. The thing was, it wasn't just any stranger. It was Keanu Reeves, an actor she had admired for years, but who she now saw in an entirely different light. What could he possibly see in her that made him want to offer help? What could she, someone who had always been independent and proud, possibly have to accept that wouldn't feel like she was failing, like she was admitting that she couldn't do it on her own? It was late afternoon when she decided to reach out. The decision had weighed on her for days, but today something felt different. Her son was in the living room, watching cartoons, and she had a moment of quiet to think. She walked over to the phone, dialed the number David had given her, and waited as it rang. "Hello." David's voice came through the line again, and for a moment, she felt the nerves start to build up once more. "Hi, David." "It's me," she said, her voice steady, though she could feel her heart thumping in her chest. "I've been thinking about it, and I think I'd like to meet Keanu. If that's still okay." There was a pause, followed by a soft laugh. "Of course it's okay. I'll arrange everything. You're making a great decision." "I don't know what to expect," she said, her voice trailing off, uncertainty creeping back in. "I don't want to make a fool of myself." "You won't. Keanu's not like that." "Trust me," David reassured her, his tone calm. "I'll send over the details. Take your time, no rush." She hung up the phone, her hands shaking slightly. It wasn't that she was afraid of meeting Keanu. It wasn't about him. Not really. It was about what this meant for her, about how her life was about to shift again, whether she was ready for it or not. She wasn't the kind of person who let others see her vulnerable side. She didn't like depending on anyone, especially not someone she didn't know. But that night, she tried to push those thoughts aside and focus on what was important, her son. The next afternoon, she found herself sitting in a small, cozy coffee shop that Keanu frequented whenever he needed a break from the world. It wasn't too far from where she lived, and the idea of meeting there made her feel a little more at ease. She had dressed casually, no reason to put on a show, she thought. She didn't know exactly what she was walking into, but she knew she had to face whatever was coming head-on. When she arrived, Keanu was already there, sitting at a corner table by the window. He looked just like he had in the diner, calm, relaxed, as if there was no rush in the world. When he saw her, he smiled warmly, standing up as if to welcome her, and for the first time since their brief encounter weeks ago, she felt the nerves settle a little. "Hi," she said, her voice just above a whisper. "Thank you for doing this. I don't know what I'm doing here, really." Keanu gestured for her to sit, his eyes filled with kindness and an understanding that made her feel like everything was going to be okay. "It's no problem at all," he said. "I just wanted to talk, to see how you were doing. No pressure. She sat down, still unsure of what to say, but his presence was so calming that the silence didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt natural, almost like two people meeting for the first time after a long time apart. Keanu didn't rush to fill the space with words, and that was exactly what she needed. She could feel the weight of her fears slowly melting, just from being in his presence, in the same way that she had felt lighter after their brief conversation in the diner. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a long pause, her voice tentative. "Of course," he said, looking at her with genuine interest. "Why me?" she asked, the question coming out more abruptly than she had intended. She immediately regretted it, but she needed to know. She needed to understand why someone like him would offer help to someone like her, someone who had spent so much time just trying to survive. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "I think it's because I see myself in you," he said quietly, as though choosing his words carefully. "I see someone who's been through a lot and doesn't ask for help, doesn't expect it, but who deserves a little kindness, a little grace. The world can be tough, and sometimes people just need a reminder that they're doing okay. I've been there too. Everyone has their battles, no matter how much they seem to have it together on the outside." She felt a lump form in her throat as she listened to him. She didn't know why, but his words struck something deep inside her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't being judged, like someone saw her for who she really was, flaws and all. I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice shaky. "I never expected this." "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his tone soft. "Just do what feels right for you and your son. That's all I ask." She nodded slowly, taking in the simplicity of his words, the truth behind them. The gesture wasn't about him feeling good or getting recognition. It was about her, and her son, and the quiet moments in life that often went unnoticed. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe, like she could let her guard down just enough to believe that things might be okay. "You've helped more than you know," she said finally, the words coming from a place of genuine gratitude. Just knowing that there's kindness in the world. It's more than I could have ever imagined." Keanu smiled, a small but meaningful gesture. That's all anyone needs sometimes. A little kindness, and the belief that it will get better. And in that moment, as she sat across from him in that small coffee shop, she realized something. She didn't need to have it all figured out. She didn't need to have all the answers. What mattered was that she was trying, that she was giving herself permission to accept help, to believe in something greater than the struggles she faced every day. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of better days ahead.